Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf Lamed Zayin. We're 11 lines from the top. Says the Gemara, Toshma, come and hear a raya. We'll move a discussion regarding the halacha of shehiyah. Can one have a pot remaining on the stove throughout Shabbos? So he places it on Erev Shabbos, but leaves it there on the stove throughout Shabbos with coals that are exposed, not shoveled nor covered. According to Chananya, that is allowed if the food in this pot was already cooked a third. At that point, it's considered to be edible. It's considered to be a din mevushal, has a status of cooked, and there is no concern of shamiyachata b'gecholim, that the person will go ahead and stir the coals to enhance the cooking process because it's already considered cooked. So that is Shitas Chananya. The Gemara had a shaila, a boilu, whether our Mishnah concurs, follows the Shita as well. Our Mishnah gives us various guidelines and restrictions regarding the kira, regarding the stove. We need to shovel or cover those coals in order to allow one to have food on the stove. The Gemara wanted to know whether this restriction, this discussion in the Mishnah, refers to shehiyah. If one merely wants to allow food to remain on his stove, he's not actually placing it on the stove, he's just having it sit there from Erev Shabbos. Do these restrictions pertain to that as well? And indeed, our Mishnah does not concur with Chananya because it requires one to shovel or cover the coals. Unlike Chananya, who says there's no concern of Shamiyachata when the food is already a third cooked. So our Mishnah, according to this version, is not following Chananya. On the other hand, perhaps our Mishnah is not discussing shehiyah. Our Mishnah is discussing chazara, which is an entirely different topic. Restoring, bringing back an item, placing a pot back on the stove on Shabbos. In that regard, one needs to be careful and shovel or cover those coals. He doesn't come to do a malach on Shabbos, doesn't come to stir them, because actually placing returning the pot onto the stove on Shabbos after he removed it, that's an active ma'isa, that's actively involving in the cooking process. Rashi says it's michsik mavashal. Others say perhaps the food has already cooled down, and when he goes and puts it back on the oven, he might go and reheat it. So chazor is more severe than shehiyah, and therefore the restrictions apply there. But we may infer from here that merely shehiyah, having the item sit on the stove, that's allowed even without resorting to shoveling or covering those coals. So the word does not show whether the Mishnah concurs with Chananya or disagrees with Chananya. Tashma, come and hear a raya. The Omar of Chelboy, Omar of Chama bar Guri, Omar Rav. So he tells us the name of Rav as follows. This is how we must interpret our Mishnah. Loishanu, the halacha in our Mishnah is only said the allowance only applies to Ela al Gaba if he has the pot on top of the stove. Aval Soicha, but to have the pot placed inside the kira, it's usher, there's no allowance for that. Let's analyze the Mishnah in light of this interpretation. How was Rav understanding our Mishnah? It's all well and fine if our Mishnah is discussing Chazorah. And with regard to Chazorah, returning the pot, putting the pot back on the stove, the Mishnah tells us shoveling or covering is required. However, shehiyah, merely allowing the pot to remain on the stove from Erev Shabbos throughout the Shabbos, no grifo ktima is required, no shoveling or covering is required, and the coals are be'en, they're present. So, Rav is telling us that shehiyah on exposed coals, that's restrictive. We must be careful only on top, but not inside the kira itself. Now we understand the difference between having the shehiyah on top of the stove where the coals aren't really there, versus putting it into the kira itself, which is right on top of the coals, or Rashi says it's called matmin mamish beremetz. So he's placing it on the coals itself. In that case, the shehiyah is prohibited because it's right near the coals, and there's a genuine concern of shamiyachata. So once again, it works well if the Mishnah is discussing Chazar. The Mishnah tells us Chazar requires shoveling or covering. But we infer from this Mishnah, the Mishnah implies to us that for Shehiyah, Garf and Katam are not requirements. The coals can be there, they can be exposed. If so, Rav tells us, one second, Shehiyah on top is allowed. That's at a distance from the coals. But inside the actual kira, which is right on top of the coals, in that case, even shehiyah is not allowed since the coals are there. There's a concern of Shamei Chat. Eloi Amris. However, if you maintain that our Mishnah's restrictions apply to shehiyah as well, that even to merely have food sit on the stove, even shehiyah requires gorafikatim, shoveling or covering those coals. If that's the case, then the coals are not there. What difference does it make if he has the shehiyah on top or inside the kira? The coals are gone. So how can you understand Rav's prohibition? Rav doesn't allow him to place the pot inside the kira, but if shehiyah requires removal or covering of those coals, what difference does it make if he's placing the pot on top or inside? The coals are accounted for. They're addressed. There's no concern anymore. If so, perhaps we can imply from the halacha of Rav that our Mishnah is discussing chazara, but shehiyah can be done even on a kira which is not goraf, not katam, even with exposed coals, in accordance with Shittas Chananya. Says the Gemara, no. You've interpreted Chelbi's din in reference to the first part of the Mishnah, and therefore you made this whole calculation. No, actually he's discussing the Seifa Kai. He's referring to the latter part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah concludes with Shittas Besilo that allow even Chazor or Besilo, even Af Machzira, even Chazor, even returning the pot on the kira is allowed, provided there was a grief of Iktima, provided the coals were shoveled or covered. On that, Rav Chelba comes and says, Chazora is only allowed el al gaba, because that's outside the kira. It's not in the inside the compartment that has that intense heat. But inside is also, even if the coals will cover the shovel, because there's still that intense heat inside, there's some concern of Shemi Yachata. The Farshim point out, even if you interpret the word grufa, shoveling, meaning that the coals are entirely removed, but we were concerned that there's some sort of a spark remaining, and from that he can ignite another fire, and he will go ahead and do the melacha of havara. So, in conclusion, there's no ra'if from our Mishnah. Perhaps, indeed, our Mishnah is discussing shehiyah, and those restrictions of grief of victim apply to shehiyah, not like the Shittas Chananya. Unlike the opinion of Chananya, even shehiyah requires shoveling or covering. The Mishnah, however, concludes with the halacha of chazara. That's agreed upon all. The Mishnah clearly says that there's a machlokes b'sham misil regarding chazara. B'sham say chazara is not allowed, but still chazara is allowed. On that comes Rav Chelva in the name of Rav to tell us that chazara is only allowed if the pot is being returned to the top, to the al-gaba of the kira, but not inside the kira. Continues the Gemara, okay, let's find another raya, how to interpret our Mishnah. Tashma, come listen to the following brisa. Base kira is hamatimus. If we have a twin kira, we have one kira attached to the other. Achas grufa ktuma, one was garaf v'katim, shoveled or covered. Va'achas, the other kira, was not addressed. She'ena grufa v'enektuma, the coals were not shoveled or covered. The halacha is mashin al gabi grufa ktuma. One can do shehiyah on the kira which was properly addressed, where the coals were covered or shoveled. Ve'in mashin shahiyah, however, is not allowed al she'ena grufa v'enektuma. Okay. Now, that's the introduction. Shehiyah is allowed on a kira which was grufa ktuma. U'mahin mashin, what type of food may he leave on the kira? Nothing. Bishamai does not hold of this entire concept. One may not even do shehiyah on a kira, even if it was garaf akat. So this is a very stringent presentation of Bishamai and Bisil Loimim, Chavin Avalei Tafshil. Shehiyah is allowed, but is restricted only to Chamin and not to Tafshil. Chamin, as we learned yesterday, requires less effort to get it cooked. So shehiyah is allowed by Chamin, but not Tafshil. So Beishamai say nothing, Beisil say Chamin we allow. What about Chazora? Once he takes the pot off the kira, can he return it? Can he replace? Okar, once he removes the pot, Chazora is never allowed. Divrei Rav Meir. So Meir presents a very stringent presentation of the Shitas B'Shamai B'Hillel. Once again, a kira, which was gara for katam, the coals were addressed, they were shoved or covered. Is shehiyah allowed? According to B'Shamai, no. According to B'Hillel, yes. And is only specific to hot water. Chazara, meaning once he took the pot off, he may never return it. All agree, chazara is not allowed. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I'm going to present Beis Shammai Beis Hillel's machlokes differently. So once again, we're speaking about akira, which is gara for katam. Says Rabbi Yehuda, Beis Shammai oimrim chamenu avaloi tavshil. Yes, shehiyah is allowed on this kira. However, it's limited to hot water. Food is not allowed. Beis Hillel oimrim chamen v'tavshil. Both are allowed. Shehiyah is allowed for both. Beis Shammai oimrim noitlan v'lo machzir. This is only regarding shehiyah, but chazar is never allowed, even if it's gara for katam. Beis Hillel oimrim af machzir, even chazar is allowed. Okay, so the Brisa presents two opinions, two approaches to the discussion between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. We have Rav Meir's approach, we have Rav Yehuda's approach. Let's get back to our Mishnah. Once again, we're uncertain as to the intentions of our Mishnah, which gives us restrictions of shoveling or covering. Is it shehiyah that we're discussing or chazar? It's all well and perfect if our Mishnah is discussing shehiyah. And for shehiyah, one needs to do grifa v'ktima, shoveling or covering. If so, it's going to be in line with Rabbi Yehuda. It's going to work well with Rabbi Yehuda's shita mentioning this brisa. He too says the same thing, that a kira which was gara for katam shehiyah is allowed under those circumstances. And we have two differences of opinion. Beis Shammai say only for chamen. Beis Hillel say chamen v'tavshil is allowed. Regarding chazor, Beis Shammai say nothing doing. Beis Hillel say chazor is allowed. That's exactly how those shitas were presented in our Mishnah. So indeed, our Mishnah is fully in line with Rabbi Yehuda. Eloi amras la'achsitnan. But if you maintain that our Mishnah's restrictions are pertaining to chazor specifically, however shehiyah, that's allowed even on exposed coals. If that's the case, masnisin mani. Who is the author of our Mishnah? Whose opinion is our Mishnah following? Lo Rab Meir, lo Rab Yehuda, but lo Rab Meir. It's not following Rab Yehuda's presentation, nor Rab Meir's presentation, as recorded in this brisa. And it's difficult to say that our Mishnah is following a third approach, a third presentation of the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. It's more likely that the Mishnah is meant to concur with one of these two presentations. Explains the Gemara, why can it be in line with any of them? Because Rav Meir, if our Mishnah is following the presentation of Rav Meir, the view of Rav Meir with regard to Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, we will find many discrepancies, many inconsistencies. Kashi le Beis Shammai bechada. We will have one inconsistency regarding Beis Shammai. Why? Because our Mishnah tells us that shehiyah is allowed even according to Beis Shammai. Even according to Beis Shammai, one may place at least hot water to be masha, to do shehiyah on chamen. And in this brisa, Rameh tells us, no, according to Beis Shammai, shehiyah is never allowed. So we have one kasha with regard to Beis Shammai. With Beis Hillel betarti, we have two with regard to Beis Hillel. Why? Because our Mishnah is implying to us that shehiyah is allowed even on exposed coals. There's no need for grifa v'ktima. Rameh tells us, no. The only time shehiyah is allowed is provided the kira was gara for katam. There is one inconsistency. Number two, our Mishnah tells us that according to Rav Meir, shehiyah is allowed by either chamen or tafshil. Rav Meir maintains that according to Beis Hillel, the allowance for shehiyah is only by chamen and not tafshil. So in total we have three inconsistencies. Apparently our Mishnah is not following the presentation of Rav Meir. On the other hand, alternatively, Rabbi Yehuda. So you propose and say that our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yehuda's presentation of those shitas. Kashi grufa v'ktuma. We have one difficulty. Our Mishnah tells us that shehiyah is allowed even when there's no grufa v'ktuma. Rabbi Yehuda clearly says that shehiyah is only allowed when it's gara for katam. So we have one inconsistency. Says La'olam, truthfully speaking, we want to maintain that our Mishnah is discussing chazara. and therefore there are restrictions of covering, shoveling the coals. Shehiyah carries no restrictions, once again, provided the food was at least a third cooked, and this is in line with Hananiah's Shita. If so, who is the author of our Mishnah? Meaning, which view is the Tana of our Mishnah following? Says the Gemara, Tana Didan, our Tana, Savla Karida B'chada. He follows the view of Rabbi Yehuda on one account, meaning in the way he presents the different views of Beis Shammai Hillel, that according to Beis Shammai Chamin is allowed, but not Tafshil. According to Beis Hillel, both are allowed. According to Beis Shammai, Chazor is not allowed. According to Beis Hillel, Chazor is allowed. So in that regard, it is a presentation, it is a structure. Our Tana concurs with Rav Yehuda. There's one difference between them. There's one machlekes, and that's regard to Garaf HaKatam. Explains the Gemara. He concurs with Rav Yehuda with regard to one angle, regarding those details. There's one difference of opinion between them. Our Tana maintains that Shia is allowed even without grief of Ktima. Rav Yehuda Savar, but Lishis Nami, even with regard to Shia, there's that requirement, Garaf HaKatam, in Eloi, but if not, then Shia is not allowed. So with regard to the general structure, they both fall in line. Our Tana with Rabbi Yehuda. With regard to this specific halacha, is Garaf HaKatam a requirement for Shia? That is a point of dispute between them. According to our Tana, there's no requirement. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there is a requirement. So let's take a summary here regarding the present moment in the Gemara. At this point, the Gemara maintains there are three approaches to the machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. We begin with Rav Meir's approach, and as recorded in the Brisa, Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are discussing a kira which is Garaf HaKatam, shoveled or covered. So according to Rav Meir, Shehiyah, Beis Shammai don't allow. Beis Hillel say Chamin is allowed. Chazar is never allowed, whether according to Beis Shammai or according to Beis Hillel. Rav Yehuda says as follows: that Shehiyah, Beis Shammai allow by Chamin, but not Tafshil. Beis Hillel say the heter of Shehiyah pertains to both Chamin and Tafshil. What about regarding Chazar? Beis Shammai say no way. According to Beis Hillel, yes, Chazar is allowed. The Gemara concluded at this point that perhaps our Mishnah concurs somewhat with Rav Yehuda with regard to the general presentation of the machlekes between Shammai and Beis Hillel. According to Beis Shammai, Shehiyah is allowed by Chamin, but not Tafshil. According to Beis Hillel, by Tafshil as well. What about Chazar? Beis Shammai, Asr Chazar, they don't allow it. According to Beis Hillel, Chazar is allowed. There's one difference between our Tana and Rav Yehuda. According to our Tana, Shehiyah doesn't require Garaf HaKatam, because Shehiyah carries no concern of, entails no chashash of Shamiyachata. It is only with regard to Chazara that there's a din of Garaf HaKatam. So indeed, at this point in the Gemara, we would like to interpret our Mishnah in accordance with Shittas Hananiah, that Shehiyah does not require Garaf HaKatam, again provided it was a third cooked. Continues the Gemara, so they ask the following question: what if a person decides to place his pot on the ground, on the floor, next to the kira? So he's placing his pot on the outside of the kira. Does that also carry those same restrictions as placing the pot inside or on top of the kira? Since here it's a bit different, that the heat coming from the kira has to travel, whether over the lip of the kira or whether through the walls of the kira. It's an indirect heat. So perhaps that's different. Says Gemara, they asked, what about smicha? Placing a pot inside the kira or on top of it is asr, it carries those restrictions. But to merely place a item next to the kira, perhaps that's different. Perhaps there's no difference. Tashma, come and listen to this right. The Brisa told us, this was the Brisa mentioned earlier, Shtei kiras hamatima, he has this double kira, one attached to the other. Achas gruf v'ktuma, one had its coals shoveled or covered. V'achas, the other one did not have so. She'ena gruf v'ktuma. The Brisa told us, Mashin al gabi gruf v'ktuma. So one may have a pot sitting on top of the kira, which is Garaf HaKatam. Says the Gemara, this is like smicha, because it is next to the other kira, which has exposed coals. Apparently that's not a problem, since it's not sitting directly on that kira, it's merely smicha. Apparently smicha is different. Says the Gemara, Ba'afagav the kosalikle, even though the kosalikle havla, there's hevel, there's heat emanating from meidach, from the other kira, we see smicha is not a problem. Says the Gemara, perhaps that's different. Why? Dil mashani hasam, that's different. The kiva the midlai, since the pot is elevated, it's sitting up high. Shalt be'avira, so the air is shelled by affects it, and the heat coming from the other kira is not so intense. So it's different than placing the pot right next to, in close proximity to the kira, placing it on the floor next to the kira. Since it's not up high, the heat that's coming is more intense and powerful. Perhaps the same restrictions apply there as well. Tashma, come and listen to this, right? Damar of Safra of Chia. So we learned as follows. The Brisa says Katma b'nislapsa. So we know that there's a requirement to shovel or to make katum, to put cover the coals with the afer, with the ashes. So what if one did that? V'nislapsa, and afterwards the flame reignited itself, rejuvenated, and here we have a full-fledged fire burning. Says the Brisa, once he did ktima, once the person covered it with the ashes, he was megaladas, that he has no intention of meddling with these coals. He expresses disinterest in getting involved any longer. Therefore, it is mutter, is considered to be a katam, and considered to have the status and din of coals that are katam. And as a result, when we place a pot next to this kira, or maintain the pot on top of it, then he can take it off, or return the pot. Says Gemara, 1 second. Apparently, smicha carries this requirement of katam. The Brisa lists smicha together with everything else. Since it was katam, smicha is allowed. Shmami no, lismich nami. Katma in, like katma lay. Apparently for smicha, katma is a requirement. So only if you did ktima, but otherwise it's not allowed. Says the Gemara, v'li tamech. But according to your version of things, let's move on. What does the Brisa say? Saimchala u'mekaymen aleh, v'noitel mimenu u'machzirin lo. So one may remove a pot and return it. Removal of a pot also carries restrictions. The Brisa, which states netila, is also specific to katma in. Only if he did ktima, then removal of a pot is allowed. Loy katma loy, but otherwise not. Can't be so. Removing a pot is allowed regardless of whether he did ktima. He's not doing anything by just taking off the pot. So apparently the Brisa is listing some items agav, only just because it falls in line with the rest of the list. Ella tana noitim shemachzirin. The Brisa expresses noitlin mishum machzir simply to introduce the halacha of machzirin, but it's not meant to tell us this chiddush that netila requires ktima. Certainly not. So the Brisa is simply using one as an introduction for the other. Here with regard to smicha, we can say smicha doesn't need the ketima. Why does the Brisa list smicha? It's merely coming to introduce the halach of mekaymen. So therefore the Brisa says it's part of the list, even though smicha certainly doesn't need ketima. So we have no raya. Says we're actually compare the two things. Is this really a comparison? Noitlin and Machzirim take place on the same place, the same location. He removes the pot and puts it back. So we understand why the Brisa puts them together. They rhyme. They work together. Tana Noitlin Machzirim. Therefore, the Brisa introduces the halach of Chazara by beginning and saying Noitlin. So he takes it off, and he could have put it back. You only put it back if you first take it off. So the Brisa is just putting them together in a sequence. Elohacha, but with regard to smicha, why does the Brisa discuss smicha at all? It's unrelated to Mekayim and Alel. They're taking place in two different locations. Smicha is outside the kira on the floor. Mekayim and Alel is on top of the kira. Why would the Brisa list smicha? Because it wants to tell us Mekayim. There's no shaykhs. There's no relation between two things. Smicha takes place in one location. Who? Mekayim and Kiyum. Mekayim and Alel is on top of the kira. It's in a different location. Why would the Brisa list smicha? Simply because it's trying to introduce us to halach of mekaymen. There's no relation between the two things. So apparently, when the Brisa tells us that a kira which was katum, where the coals were covered with ashes, In that case, smicha is allowed. The Brisa is being very explicit and specific that smicha requires that as well. Says the Gemara, "My havila." Indeed, what was the conclusion? What is the halacha l'maisa regarding smicha? Apparently, the Gemara wasn't really satisfied with this diuk, with this raya, with this inference from this brisa. We want to have something more conclusive. Toshma, come and hear the following brisa. Kira shisi kur begafes veitzim. So a kir which was fueled using the more prominent fuels of gefes, pulp, eitzim, wood, which generate coals. The brisa says, "Soimchen, one may indeed place an item next to this kira, ve'ein mekaymin aleh." However, to have something remain on top, that is not allowed. Elim kain grufa viktum, unless he shoveled or covered. So it's very clear that smicha is molinient and does not require garaf akatim. So this indeed is a raya to our question. The brisa continues, "Gecholim she'amamu." So we have coals that are dimming. He sees they're already dimming. They're already dimmed, and they don't have potential to produce much more significant heat, and he's not going to go and be mechata these gecholim. Or he placed on top of those, on top of healthy gecholim, he placed on them thin chaff of flax. In both cases, the halacha is that the coals are kikatuma. They have a din as if they're covered with ashes, and one may indeed refer to them as a katam with regard to the halachas of chazara and shehiyah. So in summary, at this point in the Gemara, it is mutter when he simply is trying to be soimech, place the pot next to the kira, on the floor next to it. The heat is diminished, it's indirect. The Brisa tells us that gecholim that are dimmed are okay. And we learned that if he went ahead and he covered those coals and they reignited themselves, they have the status of katam, and he need not be concerned with regard to those gecholim. They have a din of katam. Continues the Gemara. So we had a question once again with regard to shehiyah. If he has food which is a third cooked, k'macha ben dersoy, we had a shayla whether shehiyah is allowed. Chananya maintains shehiyah is allowed even if the coals are exposed. So we had that shayla whether our Mishnah concurs with Chananya or disagrees with Chananya. So the Gemara from here and through Amud Beis will give us various opinions with regard to this halacha. Some hold shehiyah is allowed, some hold it's not allowed. And according to Shita, that shehiyah in this case is not allowed. One needs to address those coals, shovel them or cover them. When is shehiyah allowed? So the general consensus here is that if the food is fully cooked, then in fact shehiyah is allowed, because in that case there's no concern of shamei yechata. Now what about if the food is fully cooked? It's mvushal called tzarkai, but it's still cooking further. It's getting overcooked. It's condensing. It's shriveling, and sometimes that actually improves on the quality of the taste, the flavor of the food. That's called mitztamik v'yafaloi. Mitztamik means it's condensing, it's shriveling, it's overcooking, but that benefits the quality of the food. So is that considered to be an integral part of the cooking process? And even at that point, at that moment, during that stage of mitztamik, perhaps there's still concern of shamei yechata, or perhaps not. Mitztamik is not an integral part of the cooking process with regard to the concern of shamei yechata, and there's no concern there. So the Gemara from here through Amud Beis will have a discussion, bring various shitos regarding this topic. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Achmeni, Amar Beishe, Katma v'huvara. So if he did katima, he covered those coals, but they got reignited again. In that case, mashin aleo, shehiyah is allowed. With regard to chamin, shuchmal kol tzarchan, fully cooked hot water. V'tavshel shabishal kol tzarkai, fully cooked food. Says the Gemara, fully cooked food is allowed. What about the midstomach stage? It's improving on itself. It's midstomach. It's overcooking. That's benefiting the food. Apparently, this shita of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Achmeni maintains that shehiyah is not allowed. Unlike Hanani, he holds shehiyah is not allowed, and therefore he requires that the chametz needs to be fully cooked. The tafshil needs to be fully cooked. A third cooked is not sufficient. There's a concern of Shem Yechata. Says the Gemara, if he requires fully cooked items, what about the stage of mitzvah? It's still adding to the cooking. It's still improving on itself. So why is there no concern of Shem Yechata Shma Mina? Apparently he holds mitzvah v'yafalei. Even if it is mitzvah, it's condensing and it is benefiting the food. Mutter, that's allowed. It's not considered to be an integral part of the cooking process with regard to the chashash, the concern of Shem Yechata. Once it's fully cooked, the mitzvah process will not invite one to go ahead and be inclined to stir those coals. It's already cooked enough. So is that so? Does he hold that mitzvah v'yafal is mutter? Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily so. Shani yachad katma. Let's remember, he was speaking about a case where he put the ashes on it. If that's the case, there's never a concern of Shem Yechata. So perhaps he holds mitzvah v'yafal is aser. That if not for the fact that he covered those coals, even a fully cooked item involves it has the chashash of Shem Yechata, as long as it's still somewhat improving on itself. Here it's different because he covered those coals. As if that's the case, if that's the reason why it's mutter ma'ila memra, why does he need to tell us this halacha? If he covered those coals, it's pasha, it's simple that it's mutter. Says the Gemara, he's coming to teach us a chiddush that even after the covering of those coals reignited, the flame rejuvenated itself. Still, it's mutter ma'al detema. Perhaps I would say, kiva du huvara. Once it reignites hadra milsa, kamaisa, it reverts back to its earliest stage and it doesn't have a din of katam. Kamashmalani informs us that no, once he covers those coals once, Rashi says he was megali daite, that he's not so interested in this overcooking stage in the mitzvah, and therefore there's no concern of Shem Yechata. Continues the Gemara, a similar memra Amar Rabba B'chana Rav Yechon. Kotma v'huvara. So he covered those coals and they got reignited. Mashan aleh chamin shuchman k'tzarchan. He may have do shehiyah on chamin that is fully cooked. V'tafshel shebishel kol tzarkai, food that was fully cooked. V'afilu gecholim shel roisim. Even if the coals are from this roisim wood, which are, Rashi says, they're more hot, they're hotter than ordinary coals, and they endure longer, nevertheless, it is mutter. Says the Gemara here as well, Shema Mina, apparently he holds, mutter. Even if it is improving on itself, it is overcooking and condensing and shriveling, that's not considered to be an integral part of the Ma'aseh Bishul, and there's no concern during that stage of Shem Yechata. Says the Gemara once again, Shani Yachad the Katma, was speaking about they cover those coals. If that's the case, Ma'alam Memra, what is he coming to inform us? What's the chiddush here? If you cover those coals, of course it's mutter. Says the Gemara, Hover Latzichle, he's coming to teach us, even if the coals reignited, it's still mutter. Hainu hach. If so, this memra of Rabba Barachana named Rav Yechon is an exact replica of the former memra, the former halacha. Why does the Gemara present them as two different shittas? Says the Gemara, there is an additional chiddush here. He's coming to inform us, even these powerful gecholim shel roisam, nevertheless, the same halacha applies to there as well, that if you cover them, and it's considered to be katam, and even if they got reignited, it still has the din of katam. So, at this stage in the Gemara, we have two shittas here that don't agree with Chananya. They both, Rav Yitzchak ben Achmein and Rav Yoshi and Rav Rachan and Rav Yechon, both hold that she is not allowed unless the food is fully cooked. The Gemara will tell us an opposite, will present an opposing shita in the name of Yechanan, that Shia is allowed. So a kira which was fueled using gefas ve'etzim, mashan aleh chamin, one may do Shia on this with chamin shloich makol tzarchan, not fully cooked water, v'taf shloich bishal kol tzarkai, not fully cooked food, as long as it's a third cooked. Akar lo yachser, so that's only with regard to Shia. But once you remove the food, chazar is not allowed unless achi yigroif or yachi an efer, unless he shovels or covers those coals. So apparently, if Sheshis in the name of Yechon holds that shehiyah is allowed, it is only with regard to chazara that those coals need to be shoveled or covered. Because Savar, he holds Masnis in our Mishnah, which gives us those requirements, those restrictions of shoveling and covering. Lahachshirtnan is only with regard to Chazor. Avalisha Shia Mashin. Afal Pisha and a Gorav and a Kot. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava. What's the Chiddush here? Tarvayu Tanani, both halachis. Number one, that Shia is allowed, and number two, that Chazorah is not allowed unless he shovels or covers those coals. They're both in a Mishnah. What is the point of Sheshes teaching us this halacha name of Yechanan? Lishes Tanina, we learned that Shia is allowed from the Mishnah back on Daf Yotes, which says, "Ein noisen pas v'techataner." We may not place the dough, the bread to bake in the oven. Im chashecha, close to darkness. V'lo charal gabechol, not this type of baked, this type of cake or roll on top of the coals. Ella kedei sheyiknu panel, unless there's enough time, sufficient time available to have the dough crust. Ha'kamer panel, shari la'achser. Apparently, if the crust forms, then it is allowed. Shia is allowed. So we see that once the bread is considered to be somewhat edible, has a status of bread, it is mutter to be masha. So we see clearly that shia is allowed when it is considered to be somewhat baked, somewhat cooked. So that's one thing we see in the Mishnah. The second halacha, which was that Chazorah requires Gorah for Kotim, that too is a Mishnah. Lachzer namitanina. It's our Mishnah. Beis Hillel loyman, av machzir. That Chazorah is allowed. And ad kan like kashar Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel only allowed el b'gruf v'ktuma, when he shoveled or covered. Avo b'sheinu gruf v'ktuma loy, but otherwise not. So both halachas are stated in Mishnahs. Number one, that shehiyah is allowed once the food is considered to be somewhat mevushal, somewhat baked. That is allowed even without shoveling or covering those coals. That is a Mishnah Daf Yotes. The second halacha, that Chazorah, returning the item onto the kira, is only allowed provided there was a grief of Iktima. That too is a Beferish Mishnah. That is our Mishnah, which discusses Chazorah and tells us that we need to shovel or cover those coals, and thereby allowing Chazorah according to Beis Hillel. So what's the point of Rav Sheshes? Says the Gemara, indeed, Rav Sheshes, na midiyuk de masnis kamash malon. So Rav Sheshes, indeed, is coming to tell us that diuk from the Mishnah on Daf Yotes is indeed valid. It's indeed an accurate diuk. That the Mishnah, which tells us that dough may not be placed in an oven unless there's enough time available for it to crust. Apparently, if there is enough time available for it to crust, it is mutter. So it's an inference, it's a diuk. Mishnah is discussing Isser. You cannot place the dough if there's not enough time to crust. We need to make a diuk. Shari. But if there's enough time, it's mutter. That's a diuk. We infer from the words of Mishnah that she is allowed, provided there's enough time for it to get somewhat baked. That is what Sheish is coming to teach us. That diuk is accurate and true. Continues the Gemara. So this shita will hold, no, that shehiyah is not allowed unless he was gorer for koitim, unlike shitas Chanani. And therefore he says, kiro sheisikur begefes ve'etzim, a kiro which was fueled using gefes ve'etzim, mashin oleo tafshel, one may do shehiyah on it with a tafshel shebishal kol tzarchei, provided it's fully cooked, ve'cham and hot water sheluchma kol tzarchon, fully cooked water. Even though it is shriveling, it is continuing the overcooking process, and it's benefiting the item, still it's mutter, because it's not considered to be an integral part of the cooking process with regard to shamiyachata. It's not significant enough to invite one to go ahead to tempt him to stir those coals. How can you say that mitstamek v'yafale is mutter? There's no concern of Shemiyachata with regard to Mitztamik. Even during this overcooking, this process, during this stage, it is Asr. There's a concern of Shemiyachata. Amar lei, so he responded, Atu, do you think I don't know? Damar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yudam Shmuel, that Mitztamik Yafal is Asr. I know that. Ki kamin Allah. However, my heter is in accordance with Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan Kamina. I'm discussing Rav Yochanan Shita, who tells us that mitztamik does not carry, does not involve a concern of Shemiyachat. So we have a difference of opinion with regard to mitztamik. According to Rabbi Shmuel, mitztamik is equated with the regular state of bishul, and the concern of shemechat applies there as well. According to Rabbi Yechon, it doesn't. Amalei Rav Ukmer Meisha and Rav Ashi. Atum, you, the Makarisil Rabbi Shmuel, you live next to Rabbi Shmuel. Aviduk Rabbi Shmuel, you follow their shita, and mitztamik is us. Anan, us, Navid Rabbi Yechon, we will follow the shita of Yechon. That it's mutter. Amalei Abayla Rav Yosef. What about Shehiyah? So, once again, he's asking this famous question: is Shehiyah allowed without shoveling or covering those coals or not? Do we follow Hananiah's shita or not? Ma'olishis. Says the Gemara Amrle. So Rav Yosef responded, Rav Yehuda, Mashule v'achal. They did Shehiyah for Rav Yehuda on his account, and he ate it. Apparently it's mutter. Amrle Sabai says you can't bring a right from there. Ba'minei Rav Yehuda, you can't bring a right from there. The give him a sukunu. He was struck with some serious illness, and therefore I feel with Shabbos. Nami sharla me'abelei. Pikuach nefesh is mutter. You can even cook for him on Shabbos. You can't make a riot from him. Leave a lachmai. What about for you and me, ordinary people? Is Shehiyah allowed or not? Amalei told him, Besura Mashu, in the town of Surah they did Shehiyah. How do I know? Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. Murid Uvdav. He was a very pious person, very meticulous in his ways and his halachas. Mashli v'achal. They performed Shehiyah for him and he ate. Apparently Shehiyah is allowed. Continues the Gemara, Rav Ashi. Ka'imna kamed Rav Huna. I was present in front of Rav Huna and I saw Vishoinle, they did Shehiyah for him. Kasa the harsana, this type of dish made from fish with flour. And they did Shehiyah with this dish. Va'achal, and he ate. V'lo yadana. But I wasn't sure on account of what was the reason for him permitting it. Imisham de kasavar mitztamek v'yafli mutter. If he held, perhaps he held that mitztamek v'yafli is mutter, meaning it was a fully cooked item, and it was holding at the point of mitztamek. It was improving on itself. It was condensing. It was shriveling. It was overcooking at the overcooking point. So why was he matter? Because he holds that's not an integral part of the cooking process. Mitztamek v'yafli, even if it's yafli, it benefits and aids the flavor and the taste. Mutter, there's no concern of shemeichata at that point. Perhaps that's the reason. Imishum, perhaps the reason why he was matter b'shum the isbei mecha, because it contains flour. And in that case, the overcooking process, mitztamek, is viralo. It actually deteriorates the dish. It ruins it. It degrades it. Certainly there's no concern of shemeichata. He's not going to want to stoke those flames, stir those coals to add to the cooking process because it's ruining his dish. So I'm not sure what the reason was. Is it because he holds generally that mitztamek doesn't carry a concern of shemeichata, or he holds, in this case, the mitztamek was actually ruining it? So certainly there's no concern of shemeichata. Continues the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman. So this is the general rule. Mitztamek v'yafli asa. If the mitztamek adds, benefits the dish, it's considered to be like a bishul with regard to shemeichata. Mitztamek v'rali, but if it ruins it, mutter. Klo the milsa. This is the general formula. How do we know which types of dishes are mitztamek v'yafli and which types get ruined? Call this b'mecha, food that has a dish that contains flour. In that case, the overcooking ruins it. Mitztamek v'rali. Levar, except for one type of dish, the mitavshil de lifta, a dish made from turnips. The avgav this b'mecha, even if it contains flour. In that case, the overcooking adds and benefits it. Mitztamek v'yafli. V'hanamili, only provided this by bisra contains meat, because the Rashi says the shuman habas, the fat of the meat, counteracts the power of the sharpness of the turnips, and in this case the added cooking helps it. Avaless like bisra, but if it doesn't have meat, the added cooking actually ruins it. Continues the more bisra nami, even when it contains meat, namali amar, it's only said if he doesn't need it for his guest. If he intends on serving it to his guests, which he needs to serve them a respectful looking portion. In that case, mitztamek v'raloi, it's overcooking. It ruins the appearance of the meat, and it's no good because the Rashi says the basar is not recognizable in the dish. So in this case, the overcooking actually ruins it, and it would not be considered to be like a bishul with regard to shemeichata. Concludes the Gemara. A dish made of lafta, the figs, daisa, of grains, tamri, of dates, So any one of these dishes, lafta, dais, v'tamri, mitstamek, v'ralehen, in these cases, the mitstamek actually ruins it and deteriorates the dish, and it is considered to be mutter. There's no concern of shemiyachat. So in summary, what is the halach of shehiyah on top of a kira, which is not gar for katan? We have various opinions. According to Chananya, it is mutter, provided the food is mavushal shlish, it is a third cooked. And Rashi and Tosfos both point out that we follow this shita. There are those that disagree with Chananya. The Cholkim, they hold it needs to be mavushal called tzarkai. Now, with regard to that, we have a difference of opinion. Some say, as long as it's fully cooked, even if it is mitztamik and yafaloi, the added cooking aids and benefits the flavor and taste of the food, it's not a concern. At that point, once we get to that point, there's no concern of shemei chatan. Others disagree and hold that even if it's mavushal called tzarkai, it is not mutter unless it is mitztamik viraloi, that the added cooking deteriorates the quality of the food. Otherwise, shemei chatan applies even to the point of mitztamik. Now Tosfos points out that actually there's another sheet of Rameir and Yehuda who hold that shehiyah on top of a kira which has these exposed coals, it is not mutter even by mavushal called tzarkai, and even by mitztamik v'ralin. Okay, let's make a quick chazara on today's daf. We began once again with the question of shehiyah, and the Gemara concluded that we have perhaps three approaches to the presentation of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, to the Shita of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. We have a Brisa which contains Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda. The Brisa discusses a kira which was gara for katam, according to Rav Meir. Shehiyah is allowed according to Beis Shammai, is not allowed according to Beis Shammai. According to Beis Hillel, it is allowed only with regard to hot water. Chazar is never allowed. According to Rav Yehuda, Beis Shammai allows shehiyah by chamen. According to Beis Hillel, chamen and tafshel. Regarding chazar, Beis Shammai prohibit. Beis Hillel say chazar is allowed. What about our Mishnah? We're not sure whether our Mishnah is discussing shehiyah or chazara. The Gemara wanted to propose, yes, our Mishnah is discussing chazara, and only there is grief of a required. Shehiyah is allowed even on exposed coals. And the Mishnah will follow somewhat in accordance with the sheet of Rav Yehuda in how to present the opinions of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. So once again, our Mishnah will hold that shehiyah is allowed even when there are exposed coals. There's a machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. According to Beis Shammai, shehiyah is allowed by chamen. According to Beis Hillel, chamen and tafshel. With regard to chazara, that needs gara for katam. You need to remove or cover those coals. According to Beis Shammai, even then chazara is not allowed. According to Beis Hillel, it is allowed. The Gemara told us various halachas that lismeich is mutter, to place a pot next to the kira, on the floor next to it. It doesn't contain all these restrictions. The Gemara told us that the dimmed coals are mutter, and if he went ahead and covered those coals with ashes, even if they got reignited and rejuvenated, they are considered to be mutter. And in conclusion, we have several opinions regarding shehiyah. We have Chananya who allows shehiyah if it is mavushal shlish. We have those who disagree and hold you need mavushal called tzarkai. We have those who say even further that mavushal called tzarkai is not sufficient and we need mitztamek v'ralei. And finally we have Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda who hold that in any case it's asur even if it's mitztamek v'ralei.